Welcome to our Sea, Air, Space Luncheon. Please rise for the presentation of colors and the playing of the national anthem. Advance the colors. Retire the colors. Please welcome to the stage Captain Gregory Todd for the invocation.
Let us pray. Eternal Father, in your graciousness you have given us the great honor and privilege of serving as part of the United States Sea Services. This includes the blessing of serving with shipmates we respect and value and with whom we get to share this meal. Lord, you have told us to love our neighbor, and sometimes that is to do acts of charity. May you give us vision to see the opportunities for charity all around us. But at other times, Lord, to love our neighbor means to take up the sword, to defend our neighbor against the evil that would seek to do them harm. Grant us the wisdom to wield the sword with justice and restraint, always mindful that we are under your gaze. Not by our merits, but because of your goodness, Lord, we are bold to ask for your presence with us here. Bless our food, our time together, the camaraderie we share, and the mission you have called us to. And finally, dear Lord, be with our shipmates who are on duty, underway, or standing the watch. Send your holy angels to protect them in their tasks and grant them a joyful reunion with faithful loved ones who wait for them at home. Into your hands we commend our prayers, trusting in your love and your mercy. Amen.
Please be seated and begin your meal. Join us in thanking Captain Todd, the Coast Guard Band, and the Coast Guard Color Guard. The Coast Guard Band will now play the Armed Forces Medley to include Merchant Marine. Please rise and be acknowledged during your service's song.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the 49th National President of the Navy League, Alan Kaplan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another exciting day here at Sea Air Space. We hope you've all taken the opportunity to walk the show floor, meet some new friends, and learn what Sea Air Space is all about. This has been such an exciting exposition so far, and I know this luncheon will continue to build on this momentum. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here with us today. Thank you as well to our distinguished guests in attendance, especially our flag and general officers. I'd also like to recognize and thank today's luncheon sponsor. This luncheon would not be possible without the support of Leidos, and we thank Leidos for supporting our Navy League mission. It is now my pleasure to welcome Nevin Carr, Leidos Vice President and U.S. Navy Strategic Account Executive, to the stage to present this year's USNI Emerging and Disruptive Technologies Essay Contest winners. Nevin, the stage is yours, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm not Nevin Carr. I'm Dan Berntzinghofer, and I'm with Leidos, the largest federal IT contractor and the leader in surface ship autonomy development. And I'm happy to be here today to present the 2018 Emerging and Disruptive Technology Essay Contest Award winners. So I'd like to have a few people join me up on stage. Would Mike Shagnon, the president of Leidos Advanced Systems Group, DJ Legoff, the vice president of Leidos NGen Capture, and Vice Admiral Pete Daly, CEO of the U.S. Naval Institute, please join me on stage. The third place winner, who's going to receive a cash prize and a one-year membership to the U.S. Naval Institute for his essay, Artificial Intelligence for Distributed Lethality, is Lieutenant Commander Jacob Wilson. Please come up, Jacob. Second prize for his essay titled Low Energy Nuclear Reactions, a Potential for New Source of Energy to Facilitate Emergent Disruptive Technology, is Mr. Mike Revnitsky. And first prize, who will also receive a cash award and a one-year membership to the U.S. Naval Institute for his essay, An Ace for All Seasons, as the third offset technologies mature, aspiring naval aviators need to be ready to lead autonomous systems into battle. Lieutenant J.G. Jabelli. Congratulations again to the winners. You guys can come on over, we'll take one more picture.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alan Kaplan back to the stage.
Thank you again to Leidos and Dan Brinsinghofer for that fantastic award presentation. Congratulations to the winners. Today I have the privilege and honor of introducing Admiral Paul Zukunft, 25th Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. Admiral Zukunft has been the Commandant since May 2014. He has a long and impressive career, including serving as the Federal On-Scene Coordinator for the Deepwater Horizon spill, the largest oil spill cleanup in U.S. history. He is fond and proud of saying, "The U.S. Coast Guard punches above its weight class, and it's been through his leadership that this has been possible." As I'm sure we are all aware, Admiral Zukunft is retiring next month, but there is no doubt that his vision for the Coast Guard will persist for a long time to come. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend Admiral Zukunft.
Thank you, Alan. Well, good afternoon. And congratulations to the Navy League. This is the largest event ever. This has become the Woodstock, I guess, if you will, of exposés. But I think it's also indicative of what's happening in our country as well. And once we get this, we'll try to get that moving here at some point. So, but I also want to thank Leidos as well for hosting this lunch today. And when I look at the theme for this year's Sea, Air, Space Symposium, when you talk about learn, compete, and win. So let's ask ourselves, what does it mean to win in the 21st century? So let's face it, it's 2018, but let me take you back 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, our Marines were besieged, and President Johnson was thinking about using tactical nukes to free up our Marines. In 1 week, we had 3 Navy ships run aground. We had a B-52 with 4 hydrogen fusion bombs crash in Greenland. We had a Navy strike fighter hit the Oakland Bay Bridge. We had the USS Pueblo incident. And yes, the USS Scorpion went down with 99 souls on board. And what else was happening in our country? On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and we activated the National Guard. RFK was assassinated shortly thereafter, and then President Johnson said, "I will not seek, nor will I accept the nomination to be your president." So that happened 50 years ago. And so what do we learn from 50 years ago to the world that we live in today? And we often think we live in a much more complex world today than we did 50 years ago. But if there's one constant, what has changed is our United States has the best Navy. the best Air Force, the best Army, the best Marine Corps, and the best United States Coast Guard. And if you're going to compete, in the 21st century, you've got to dominate. You cannot compete if you're marginalizing your capability. If you're going to compete, you've got to compete from a platform of strength. And when I look at, we have 14,000 attendees at this year's Sea, Air, and Space. What's happened? We lifted budget caps. Yes, it's a bull market, but it doesn't just go out and spend money. Let's spend money wisely so we can compete from a platform of strength. And when you look at 2019, things look even better yet. And for the United States Coast Guard, first I want to thank our Coast Guard band, our honor guard, and it's a real honor to represent my service during lunch today. Our funding went 15% above presidential guidance. The first time since 2011 with the Budget Control Act that we're actually funded above the floor. So we've finally got our head above water. But this is for a service that 5 years running now has 5 consecutive clean financial audit opinions. We do a lot of work with some of you in the audience today. We are delivering platforms on schedule, on budget, that not only meet, but they're exceeding our operational requirements. And that's important, because if you're going to invest and innovate going forward, you also have to invest from a position of strength here in Washington, D.C. What is your return on investment? What are your metrics? And are you meeting schedule? Are you meeting budget? Are you meeting performance? And you have the metrics to back that up. Do you have a strategy? We used to be a service that would get a budget, and out of that we'd figure out, we don't know what to do with this. Let's try to come up with a strategy. That is not the way to run an organization. Your strategy has to drive the budget. The strategy has to reflect the context of what is happening in the world today. So let's look at what's happening in the world today. I call it VUCA. VUCA is an acronym. It means volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we've got all of that. What you see here are hurricanes Irma and Maria, and a little bit of what's left of Hurricane Harvey in the Gulf of Mexico. Growing demands. What is happening in the world around us? I go out of my way to actually see what is happening in the world around us. I went up to the island, the village of Sheshmarif, with Senator Sullivan this past summer. And when we arrived there, we noticed that the homes are being washed into the ocean, and this village is voting itself off the island, along with 30 other villages north of the Arctic Circle. They're seeing a sea change where they have lived for the last millennium. The year before that, I went out to Greenland with Senator Angus King, and we visited the Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland. As we flew out there, we saw rivers running off this ice field into moulins, which are big sinkholes, and where does that water go? It goes into the North Atlantic Ocean. Where does it end up? It ends up in places like Larchmont, Virginia. Homes that were worth nearly $1 million a few years ago, but are now swamped in seawater on every high tide. But we visited the glacier, and we met with the Inuit elders. We just asked, what's happening here? They said, well, this glacier hadn't moved in the last millennium, but in 5 years, it's retreated 25 miles. We are seeing a change that we could never even think of years ago. So we need to think about contingencies like what we had last year. 1,000-year floods, 52 inches of rain in Houston, Texas. The year before, we had a 500-year flood in Baton Rouge. So in consecutive years, you've got a 500-year flood, you've got a 1,000-year flood. We moved over 1,000 helicopters, 3,000 people. When the storms arrived, we moved into it, saved over 12,000 lives. The brand of the Coast Guard went up. Our budget went up as well. But we got to pay attention to this. Where are you going to build your infrastructure for the workforce of today, but also tomorrow? Look at Hampton Roads, Virginia. We have land subsidence, and we have a rising sea level. Things we need to be thinking of going forward as well. Other growing demands, you cannot go around the world and touch foot on almost any continent right now to witness the fact that we are not a world breaking out in tranquility. What we saw in Syria, as we make preparations with the DPRK, a key negotiation that will probably come up in June, to be able to provide elected leadership options. And the Coast Guard provides different types of options. You may have heard about the Gray Coast Guard, an instrument of diplomacy, if you will. How we learn to get along with others. This is an icebreaker. It is up in the Arctic. It is in an area that we call the extended continental shelf of the United States. It's an area about the size of the state of Texas, in a region where about 1/3 of the world's unexploited natural gas, in relatively shallow water, about 13% of the world's oil and about $1 trillion worth of rare earth minerals are on that seafloor. That is not a Coast Guard cutter. That is a Shui Long. That's one, and China is going to soon take delivery of a second icebreaker. Now, we can claim this extended continental shelf of ours, except for one thing. We have not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. And we are now in the same club with 3 other nations that have not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, namely Iran, Libya, and North Korea. I have a problem with that optic. If we're going to be a global leader in the maritime domain, we have got to sign on to the governance model, which is the Law of the Sea Convention as well. Good news. 1819, we've already put out our request for a proposal to start building heavy icebreakers. It's not a request because we can now write the check to pay for it, and then another one to come behind it, but we need a fleet of 6 of these. More importantly, we need to make the investment in our military industrial complex. Build these in the United States with U.S. steel, with U.S. workers to make that investment. It's going to be a smart investment. Russia has got 40 of these icebreakers. They have claimed all the way up to the North Pole. As the Arctic has opened up, they've claimed most of it. And they're starting to do what we've seen in the East and South China Sea with the 9-dash line in China. And we're trying to exert sovereignty with reports and paper. You cannot exert sovereignty by demarching someone that doesn't play by the rules. You've got to have presence. And so good news moving forward, we are making investments in this domain. If there's anything I could do is how do we move the clock even forward yet? I know I've got Admiral Stowe's here. I've got some of my acquisition team, and I said we need this thing done by 2023. And for us, that seems like light years. I look at a ramp being built on 295. Actually, I've watched it being built now for 8 years. When I was here last time, when I went off for 2 years, when I came back, 4 years, it's still not done. Across from our old headquarters, a soccer stadium where they just broke ground last year is going to open on July 1st. We need to learn from agility and acquisition to meet pressing sovereign requirements, and we need to do that in the Arctic as well. Here we talk about charting the course. What you're looking at actually is an inland construction tender. This is actually part of our, if you want to call it, our infrastructure, our maritime infrastructure. We have 35 of these ships. Their average age is 56. The oldest is 73 years old. What's key about these platforms, the waterways that they mark move $4.6 trillion every year in maritime commerce. We need to recapitalize this fleet. And in our 18 budget, yes, we're going to recapitalize this fleet as well. Cost less than $25 million a copy. Return on investment, $4.6 trillion. When we had Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria hit, we had ports shut down from Corpus Christi, Texas, all the way up to Charleston to include the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And you can't reprovision these ports unless they're properly marked. Oil prices were already starting to spike, but those channels were properly marked before the first tanker came in. We do not want to be the roadblock to prevent this economic potential from coming in. So we're going to call these new ships waterway commerce cutters. We've always talked about this mission of ours, but we never talked about what is the return on investment. And I think a $4.6 trillion return on investment which helps fund our Defense Discretionary Fund, is actually a pretty good investment. We also look at how do we build capacity, not just within the United States, but how do we work by, with, and through other partners. This happens to be a picture of UNITAS, where we do this combined exercise with all the nations, the navies, the coast guards of Central and mostly South America. This is not an area of emphasis for our United States Navy right now, and rightfully so, as you look at repositioning to other threats around the world. And so the Coast Guard is working on building these partnerships. When Hurricane Harvey hit in Texas, we ran the largest search and rescue exercise in history in Iceland. This very same cutter was up in Iceland doing that exercise. But more importantly, who else was there? Finland was there, Sweden was there, Norway was there, Canada was there, all participating. Russia was there. Yes, we've got to have a dialogue with peer competitors, or what we might call adversaries, but we do need to keep these windows of dialogue open. And that's where the gray Coast Guard comes into play. How do we want to shape the Arctic going into the 21st century? Do we want Arctic Brigade combat teams, or do we look at what are the near-term threats? And the nearest term threat is the environment itself. An opening ocean, displaced now with human activity, and a pristine environment. And we can get 8 nations to agree that those are the highest priorities that we need to focus on. But how do you use the Coast Guard as a mechanism to help shape this environment? So again, building global capacity. Now remember back in the days when I would come off a patrol and you would not see what is $1 billion worth of cocaine on one Coast Guard cutter that literally paid for itself on one deployment, a ship that'll be in service for over 30 years. Yes, there's a lot of cocaine coming out of Colombia right now, and it's landing in Central America. It's shipped in bulk, and that it arrives, in discrete quantities through and around our border to the southwest for consumption in the United States. Why? 2016, 64,000 Americans killed due to drug overdose. 2017, we're now 66,000. 64,000. That's more than the Vietnam and Korea conflict nearly combined. 20 times the number killed on 9/11. And it's happening every day. During the time that we have this discussion today, we will have lost another 25 U.S. citizens due to drug overdose. It's not just opioids and fentanyl, it's also cocaine laced with fentanyl as well. In 2016, nearly 11,000 of those deaths were related to cocaine. Now, what you see in the foreground is a new tactic and technique that we use, and that's a small unmanned aerial system. But even more importantly, it's all of the intelligence that is fused on these new ships. Gone are the days where we sweep the ocean like mowing the lawn, hoping we stumble on something. We vector these ships to where we know the threat is at. And if there's one thing we have an advantage of is on the water, these transnational criminal organizations cannot corrupt law enforcement. And 100% of them are prosecuted here in the United States, where the prosecution rate in countries like Honduras and in Mexico are less than 5%. It's catch and release. So when they would see the Coast Guard show up, they would ditch the drugs, ditch the electronics, hoping we couldn't build a case. So we started deploying with these small unmanned aerial systems. And our skippers didn't grow up with this stuff. The junior officers, hey, we can figure out how this works. When we detect them, let's just lay in wait. In fact, let's stalk these go-fasts loaded with a couple of tons of cocaine. And eventually, they've got to eat, they've got to rest, sleep. And we'd wait until that point in time, and it would be their wake-up call. A Coast Guard boarding team. We seize the electronics. We do digital forensics. We take biometrics. No shots are fired. We lower the threat, but the return on investment. But then how do you innovate? And then make very small investments, such as small UAS, with a great return on investment. We're moving out on land-based unmanned aerial systems. Huge demand right now for reconnaissance platforms. And the area where we operate is not the highest when you look at how do we rank order national security threats. And so it's great you bring more ships into play, but you need the reconnaissance tool to match that as well. And then how do you use cyber? We look at cyber through three different lenses. One, we need to defend it. We want to prevent adversaries from compromising our systems. Two, we need to leverage it. A year ago last year, we were tracking 6 different events. 6 boats, 30 feet in length, spread over an area of the entire continent of North America. Using cyber, we were able to track all 6 of them, put a helicopter on top of and a boat next to each one of them, and we were 6 for 6. So we can use cyber in an offensive capability. But at the same time, industry is very dependent on cyber. And if you just follow what is happening in the IT sector right now, and where is AI going into the future? This is not a learn, compete, win, and then win at cyber. This is you might win an inning. But this is the infinite game, especially when we look at cyber, and what are we doing to keep a step ahead? And this does concern me, because on open source, China is taking its national resources to invest in quantum computing. I would liken this to when we woke up when Russia put Sputnik into outer space. And President Kennedy said, we will put a man on the moon. And we started a space program, but we were late to the game. We don't have a mechanism in the United States right now of how do you pull whole of industry, not whole of defense, whole of industry, to keep ahead when it comes to quantum computing and artificial intelligence. Because who is ever first out of that starting gate can use those tools to go after a connected world. And we look at the technology world that we live in today. So that's another area where we need to look at how do we keep ahead as well. And then finally, we need to keep investing in top talent. As General Mattis would say, or now Secretary Mattis, you get the performance, you reward. Here we are rewarding Sarah Wickenheiser. And she's one of our valued civil servants. And what's great when our civilians come work for us, they challenge the status quo. They have radical candor. And if you are a leader that said, we've always done it that way, and don't speak out of turn, you'll be polite. You're talking to a senior officer here. You've got to champion those great ideas. As I like to say, the best ideas in the Coast Guard never originate from the person who sits behind my desk. But if the person who sits behind my desk does not champion these new ideas and how do we look at the world differently, then you are a CEO of a failing organization. So yes, we need to invest, but we also need to innovate. And if we're going to learn, compete, and win, you cannot rest on your laurels and say, we won. The game is never over. It is an infinite game. If you look at the drug campaign that we're in right now, and I call it a campaign, not a war infers victory is at hand. Now, we're doing one piece of this, how do you apprehend and limit the supply coming into the United States? But it's a campaign, and I work with the entire interagency. It says, we have got a behavioral health epidemic on our hands right now. And so how do we champion those best ideas? Those 66,000 Americans cut across every spectrum in our society. It is not limited to one segment or the other. And the sad news is the trend is not moving in the right direction. That is a campaign. Afghanistan, you can argue, is a campaign, perhaps generational in nature. What does winning in Afghanistan look like? How does Afghanistan leadership reconcile and then reconstitute governance in some of these countries? But what you really have to look at, if not for the United States, where would world order be today? And maybe it's not in the best of shape, but if not for the United States, I would speculate that the world would be in a severe state of disorder today. We have allies that look to the United States. They're looking for predictability. They're looking for us to be that willing partner as much as we look to them as well. And so as we look at where do we invest, where do we innovate, it really begins with building trusted relationships. It begins with, first of all, building trust within your service to be a trustworthy service to begin with. and then go out and be the trust builder, if you will, the bridge builder to build those relationships, to invest and innovate on a global scale as well. So as we use the theme for this year's Sea, Air, Space, Learn, Compete, Win, this is the infinite game. You might have won the inning. The game goes on forever, but we will never win the complete game. And we will certainly lose this game if we take our best players off the field and we send them off and say, we're good for now. Because we have peer adversaries that are out there right now competing on a daily basis. We've got to stay in the game. And so, yes, as a service that punches above its weight class, when I gave the talk last year we were funded in the featherweight class of boxing. So if you're in the featherweight class, the only weight class you can do is punch up. You're like the New York Mets of 1962. You have nowhere to go but up. And so the good news is we are now a middleweight contender. We are not a nuclear enterprise, so I will never be the heavyweight. But we are right where we need to be as a solid middleweight contender, working shoulder by shoulder with the best armed services across this great globe of ours. So with that, what I'd like to do is cede the remainder of my time to hear what's on your mind for question and answer. So again, thank you for allowing me to share lunch with you today.
Yeah, Admiral Zukunft, hi, Cal Biesecker with Defense Daily to your right, and back.
Oh, way back there, I got you.
Hey, you know, you've talked a lot in the past, and I think Admiral Papp did as well, the need for a $2 billion floor for your acquisition budget and 5% annual increases for your O&S budget. But with the offshore patrol cutter starting to be produced later this year, and you got funding for the first icebreaker, but as you said, and you seem more committed now than ever, that we need 6. Is $2 billion enough, at least over the next 10 years, annually to fund you know, the icebreakers and offshore patrol cutter, and then not to mention, you know, just the other assets, and maybe even a 12th national security cutter should Congress decide to give you the funding for that. And then, of course, a lot of these are high-tech assets. I know you're retiring some of the legacy assets that are expensive to maintain, but the new stuff with all that high-tech isn't cheap either. So is 5% annually enough as well going forward for your O&S budget?
Yeah. Cal, great question, and quite honestly, those two do balance out, and I was negligent in not recognizing the offshore patrol cutter. We'll start we're building one now. The first one comes out in 2021. But when you look at the $2 billion, and that's a floor, there will be adjustments. As we look at icebreakers, we deliver the first one, and we've made it known in the request for proposal process, we would like to consider a block buy. Now, this is the highest priority for the Coast Guard right now because we actually have no self-rescue capability in the United States if our only heavy icebreaker becomes beset in the Antarctic. And the Polar Star just returned from there this past year. The year before last, it was over 80 miles of 12 to 14 feet ice. It's the only ship in our inventory that can do that mission. So you want to look at a block buy. So maybe you need spikes, but $2 billion is a floor. And there might need to be some adjustments going forward. 5% annualized growth in our OE account is absolutely imperative. If I go back to 2011 to where we are today, through 2017, in 6 years, we lost nearly $1 billion in operations and maintenance funding because we were funded below the Budget Control Act floor for 7 consecutive years. So we need to get above the floor. We're barely at the floor right now, but 5% annualized growth allows us to keep up with the OE tail, if you will, on these new systems that we're bringing in. It's no different in the Coast Guard than it is in other sea services. As we're building more complex platforms, we're putting fewer people on them. When you look at the Hamilton-class cutter, it had a crew of 170 on it. And when something broke, you fixed it on the fly. When something breaks now, you send an email to a contractor. Meet me in Busan. The maintenance becomes very expensive as you become more dependent on contracted services. So we need to strike the right balance between organic and what's the right level of manning needs to be, and then what do we do with contracting maintenance. We were able to finally close out the decision on multi-crewing ships. And we took the lesson from the Navy when we looked at the littoral combat ship. 3 crews, 2 ships, doing multi-mission operations. Ours was even more complex because it was going to be 4 crews, 3 ships, and those 3 ships are in different home ports. And at the end of the day, you start looking at, well, what is the passover from one crew to the next? Did we forget to tell you, oh, by the way, there's a hole in the lube oil cooler, and now you're towing a ship off of mission. And you're doing multi-missions as well. And the cost of multi-crewing gets very pricey. So we're now back to what's always served us well. 1 crew, 1 ship, with an operational tempo of 185 days, away from home port. But if we need to surge that, at least it gives us the surge capability. Now, this is an anecdote, but I think it would be true of anywhere. In Christmas of 2016, I visited a 72-year-old Coast Guard cutter. My wife and I did. We showed up unannounced down at Fort Macon, North Carolina. Now, the watchstander was using the head. So when I went on board, he wasn't in the engine room, he wasn't in the pilot house, wasn't on the mess deck. I told my wife, stay here. I probably know where he's at. And I rattle on the door, and I said, hey, Merry Christmas. It's the commandant of the Coast Guard. Now, he didn't believe in Santa Claus because he used a very foul name for Santa Claus. He said, yeah, and I am Santa Claus. And I said, well, I'm not Santa Claus, but I am the commandant of the Coast Guard. And I've never heard someone pull up their pants, buckle their belt, and recover so quickly. But I asked him a question. I said, what is the best ship in the United States Coast Guard? He goes, well, sir, the ship you're on right now, my ship. You know, when your crew says this is their ship, when you look at these crew members, when you say, what keeps you in the Coast Guard? They say it's the relevancy of what we do. We're empowered in what we do to make decisions. We've got E4s driving $3 million boats, using up to deadly force with no one looking over their shoulder, interacting with our U.S. citizens, foreign nationals. We empower them to do that. So when we start looking at the quality of people coming in, I'm really taking your question off the reservation here, Cal, but it's a point I wanted to drive home. 92% of our first-term enlisted are re-upping. In fact, over 40% that leave our boot camp today will be on active duty 20 years from now. 60% of our officer corps from commissioning will be on active duty 20 years from now. So if you don't have to retrain your workforce day in and day out, there's huge efficiencies to be had. We have now gone 7 consecutive years without an aviation mishap, without a death in the air. Now, you've seen what's happened here of late. As I said earlier, we sent over 100 helicopters into Hurricane Harvey. For 3 days, they flew in hurricane conditions with ceilings near zero. Yet we've gone 7 years without a loss of life in our aviation community. I don't want to wish that upon myself, but I say that with confidence when I fly with our air crews. When they listen to the most junior member to seriously do risk management. And it was during Hurricane Harvey, one of the flight mechs said, hey, you know, sir, I think we just need to shut down and we're going to have to camp out in this helicopter. He says, hey, you know what? You're right. So they shut down in some remote parking lot in Alice, Texas. And as soon as they shut down, a black SUV pulls up, and it wasn't mine. These were Texan residents. They said, you guys have saved 12,000 Texans. We are not going to let you sleep in this helicopter. We will watch your helicopter. You're sleeping in a warm bed. You're going to get a hot meal. You come home with us. And so I think just that connectivity that we have with the communities that we serve, it really does invigorate our people. They really want to stay with us. So I took you off the reservation there, Cal, but I really had to bring the workforce into this conversation. It's not just about platforms and ships and budgets. At the end of the day, it really is about our greatest strength, and that's our people. Next question.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Admiral. I'm sorry. Good afternoon, Admiral. I'm at your target angle 350.
I got you. Okay.
First of all, sir, I would like to, my name is Everett Hayes. I'm from Suss Consulting. I'd like to thank you for your decades of service, and I would like to be one of the first to wish you a fair wind and following sea.
Oh, thanks, Everett.
Sir, my question is, I'm sure that when you joined the Coast Guard some decades ago, you could not have imagined the places where Coast Guard would be serving. I know for a fact that I've served with guys in Bahrain on visit board ships and that kind of thing. And if you've been watching the news in the last few days, you've seen we put the National Guard down on the border doing some work down there. What I'd like to ask you, sir, is if you can see the Coast Guard, I know you're part of DHS right now, but if you see yourself expanding the role or being called into another part of the services, either in defense or being called in to do work on the border like that, being part of the National Guard. But, I just wondered if you see the role of the Coast Guard changing or being integrated more in the defense, and if you see yourself working more on that southern border.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Everett. The epiphany for me was at the International Sea Power Symposium 2 years ago. And I'm sure Admiral Richardson regrets allowing me to do the opening keynote, because I started talking about some of the threats that we're seeing around the world. Migration that is hit levels that we hadn't seen since World War II. Ungoverned territories in the maritime domain that give rise to piracy. We have fish poaching. We have a world population of 7 million that's going to grow to 10 in the next 15 to 20 years, 10 billion people. Right now, 3 billion people subsist on fish as a source of protein. We have the whole global domain on which international trade rides, and obviously natural disasters and search and rescue and all that. For the next 2.5 days, 108 nations, all we talked about were Coast Guard things. It was finally the CNO of the Indian Navy said, hey, can we talk about theater ballistic missile defense? But what most nations were looking at, what are the immediate threats to their maritime sovereignty? And they were very Coast Guard-alike. It's a little bit ironic, but we have one of our Hamilton-class cutters now serving in the Vietnam Coast Guard. During Vietnam, it was deployed on market time doing naval gunfire support into Vietnam. We're doing a lot of work in Vietnam, in Puerto Rico, in Indonesia. We will be sending national security cutters off to the East and South China Sea next year, as the China Coast Guard has now merged into their defense structure to look at how do U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard use this very similar model over there. So what we are starting to see is a burgeoning role for Coast Guards, what I would say almost an era for the Coast Guards. But for many of these countries, they can't afford a Navy. In fact, they can't afford a U.S. Coast Guard. But what they lack are, first of all, the authorities that we have, and then obviously the competencies. As an armed service, we have bilateral agreements to board the flags of over 60 different ships in their territorial sea or on the high seas. We don't have to wait outside, which is almost uncanny if you think of it. If you were to reverse that around and say you're up at Ocean City, Maryland on Labor Day weekend, and you see a boat 3 miles offshore, then out of nowhere comes this Colombian helicopter with M240 rounds shooting warning shots and then a sniper trying to shoot out the outboard. We would call that an act of war. We do that 3 times a week in Central and South America because the other nations trust us to be their enforcement arm. So much so that when we have an apprehension, they say, we're not even sure we can convict these cases. Why don't you send them back to the United States? We sent over 600 smugglers back to the United States to be prosecuted. Many of them are on their 3rd, 4th run, and then they're caught. These are not career-long smugglers. We're trying to get to a point where they say, hey, it is not worth doing this business anymore. We have a great program. We work with the Department of Justice. If they want to turn evidence, they'll get a more lenient, as in 12-year sentence. If they don't, it's 20. And they're cut off from their families, and they're cut off from their networks. So we're trying to use that as a deterrent model to discourage people from being out there. But we have more and more people looking at white ships with red stripes to be, a force for, really leveling the playing field against transnational criminal organizations. But they are everywhere. A $750 billion industry. And we're going at it with a $12 billion budget. Thanks, Everett.
Admiral Zukunft, we'll have time for one more question.
Okay. Oh, that's voice of God. Okay. Okay. Don't need one. Yeah. Well, hey, hey, thanks. No. So let's go back to April 4th, 50th anniversary of the slaying of Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, you could not have seen a more divisive nation. Yes, we launched the National Guard. They were at the Capitol lawn steps 50 years ago. But what also happened on April 4th, 2018, Captain Thomas Herdin was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. Now, you might want to ask, who is Captain Thomas Herdin, U.S. Navy retired? So in 1950, during the Chosin Reservoir campaign in North Korea, Thomas Herdin crash lands his jet. Crash lands it to save the life of his wingman, Jesse Brown, Ensign Jesse Brown, his best friend. The first African-American strike fighter. 1950. There is a pioneer. And I remember meeting Thomas at a Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House. And he asked my aide at the time, he wanted to know how we were doing diversity-wise. And he said, you need to do better. So I want to thank you for the shout out, but we still need to do better. And I'll just close you with one other thought. I was at the funeral of our prior Secretary of Transportation, who was our service secretary when I was a cadet at the Coast Guard Academy. His name was William Coleman. And if you want to know the rest of the story about William Coleman, it goes like this. He went to high school in Germantown, Pennsylvania. He went out for the swim team. And as soon as they did, they disbanded the swim team because we don't want people of your color in the swimming pool. The courses he took, and he was a very diligent student, and his teacher said, you know, William, someday you might make a good chauffeur. Well, he was more than just, he never became a chauffeur. No, he went off to Harvard Law School. He was the editor of the Harvard Law Review. He graduated summa cum laude. He was #1 in his graduating class from one of the most esteemed law schools in the nation. And he couldn't get a job. He could not get a job. Thurgood Marshall was doing work with the NAACP. He says, you can come work with me. And then when Thurgood Marshall became a Supreme Court justice, he said, William, I want you to clerk for me. And it was William Coleman who wrote most of Brown versus Board of Education. And then he went on to become the Secretary of Transportation. I didn't know this story until I went to his funeral this past March. Actually, March of 2017. Was not provided an opportunity. We as a nation still have a way to go to open the door to opportunity. We're making good headway in the Coast Guard, but in 4 years, we didn't advance the ball as far as I would have liked. And this really is an all-hands-on-deck effort. It is good to see some diversity in this room. I don't see enough of it. It's great to see more women involved. Our Coast Guard Academy today is 40% women, 33% underrepresented minorities. When I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy, we were 1%. 1% minority. So I would say that's progress, but we still have a way to go, especially when we start looking at the eligibility of 17 to 24-year-olds to serve in the armed services today. Roughly 25% meet our requirements. 75% do not. And of that 25%, many others want them to go work elsewhere and not in the armed services. I'm going a little bit over here, but it's worth telling, especially to this audience. I sponsored a recruit company at Cape May this past fall. Everyone is a college graduate. Out of 100, over half of them have been to college. And out of that, we had 9 master's degrees to be E2s in the United States Coast Guard. I asked them 2 things. How did you find out about the Coast Guard? And they didn't go to our webpage. It was a neighbor, it was a friend, it was a relative, it was that face-to-face contact. Say, hey, you ought to look into the Coast Guard. Face contact first and foremost. But then I asked them, why did you join the Coast Guard? And they didn't say it's to get my VA benefits, it's to get that big paycheck. They joined to serve. They have that service before self mentality. So say what we might want about the next generation or millennials, they want to serve. What we need to do is provide them the opportunities to serve, to empower them to serve, and more importantly, recognize them when they do serve. So as it's nearing the sunset of my time in service in this Coast Guard, I do leave it better, but I leave it better because of the many who came before me, and it's the many who are out there standing the watch that I serve them in all that they do as well. So again, Alan, thank you. I want to thank Navy League. Again, Leidos, thank you for this great event. And I get to come back again tonight. So I had dinner at the White House last night, had breakfast with the service chiefs, I had lunch with you. I'm living high on the hog. So yeah, this is going to be really tough to give up. But thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the National Executive Director of the Navy League of the United States, James Bruns.
Thank you, Admiral Z. That was phenomenal remarks. Navy League of the United States was created in 1902. It was the brainchild of our 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore returned to the Navy League in 1908 when he had sent the Great White Fleet around the world. In fact, he got it halfway around the world and didn't have enough money to bring her home. So he turned to the Navy League to twist the arms in the Hall of Congress to make sure that our fleet came home, and we did. And Admiral Z, we are so proud of our role in helping to provide the necessary funding support for our Coast Guard, including the newest icebreaker. So we will continue to pledge our support to the Coast Guard and work with you and your successor to make that happen. I hope you'll accept this on behalf of the Navy League of the United States. It's a Navy League sea bag. Thank you. We want to thank Leidos for all their support in making this luncheon possible. Ladies and gentlemen, please refer to your program for all the educational activities that we have during the course of the day. And on behalf of the Navy League, I want to thank you for your support and for participating in this lunch. Have a good day.